You know, when it came to the NES, most of my gaming reflected the things that were released exclusively for the console. Stuff like Mega Man, stuff like the Super Mario Brothers games. But there were always things like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 2, the arcade game. What's going on, everybody? I'm Jay. Welcome to Square Pegs. And today we are taking a look at 10 games on the NES and their counterparts in arcades. So we're just going to run alphabetically, and I want to point out that every single game on this list, while the NES one is definitely lacking in the visuals compared to its arcade counterpart, they're not missing the fun factor. Each game is so much fun to play. I want to say that all right now. So don't think I'm bagging on anything for the NES or the arcade. Every game here is really fun to play, and no questions asked. 1943, the one we're starting off with, is a blast. This is a vertical shooter where you're going from bottom of the screen to the top of the screen. You're fighting in 1943 in the Pacific Theater, and you are flying a plane. It's really great. And the arcade versus the NES counterpart is really sharp. Now, like I said, visually it's not as nice as the arcade version, but the gameplay-wise is spectacular. And even though it doesn't quite hold up to its arcade counterpart, 1943 is not a bad-looking game on the NES. Everything looks good. The levels are fun. It's fast. It's aggressive. It's a really entertaining title. It's not as hard as its arcade version, but then again, it's also not made to munch quarters, so you get that when you play the home version. Both games are really good, though. 1943, both in the arcade and on the NES, really solid titles. Now, as I have discovered in my years of being on YouTube, the fact that I am not the biggest Contra fan might be one of the most controversial things that I apparently have ever done in my life, because boy howdy do y'all love Contra. And I don't hate Contra, it's just not my favorite game. I think there are better games out there. But when I play Contra, I look at the NES version first, because that's the one that comes to mind. And I do think it's a better game than the arcade port. Now, the arcade version is great. The arcade version is fine. But the NES version just works better for me. Like, that's the one that I go to. That's the one I default to. And that's the one that's first up in my mind when I think of Contra. Like, the arcade game is fine, but the NES version just did something better. Like, it was just a more perfect experience, I think, from top to bottom, is how it works for me. Now, I don't think either of them are bad by any stretch of the imagination. I just think the arcade version can be unnecessarily difficult and kind of like needlessly unforgiving, which kind of sucks. I mean, the NES version can too, don't get me wrong. There's a reason the Konami code's in there, but I do think that of the two, Contra on the NES is the better game, both gameplay-wise and visuals, dare I say it? So prepare yourselves, because not only am I not a huge Contra fan, I'm not a big Double Dragon fan, at least not the first one. I love Double Dragon 2. I think that might be my favorite beat-em-up on the NES. But when I compare the original Double Dragon to its arcade counterpart, this, of all the games on this list, might be the only one where I go, yeah, this one kind of falls far behind. The gameplay just isn't there for the NES version. Like, it's just not as enjoyable an experience as what we got on the arcade. The magic of having that extra button really does help the arcade release. But the game on the NES is a little more forgiving. Like, the arcade game is clearly designed to eat quarters. This one on the NES is designed to be a little bit more forgiving and a little bit more accessible. And in some ways, that makes it a little bit more enjoyable. Now, both games are fine. Both games are fun. I do think subsequent releases in the series are better for both arcade and home console ports, but this one here, both for the gameplay on the NES and the overall presentation value on the arcade version, Double Dragon is pretty solid. It's a classic beat-em-up for a reason. Alright, here's one that I hadn't actually played before filming the content for this video. This is Dragon Spirit. Now, from what I understand, technically the NES release is a sequel of the arcade original, but I don't know if that's accurate, because like the intro on the arcade release and the NES release are identical. I'm going to show those side by side here, because it's actually kind of cool that they captured this so well on the NES. But this, much like 1943, is a vertical shooter, and rather than flying a plane this time, you are using a dragon, and that is super cool. I really, really like this one. Now, it is proper difficult, proper both NES and arcade hard. Like, this is a game that is designed to make you have to keep playing and try to memorize, you know, different muscle memory things for the level so you can dodge bullets and dodge attacks. But the game itself is really fun. I am very impressed by this one. This is one that I had no idea existed. and I'm glad I've discovered it because I think it's a really fun title, both arcade and NES. Legitimately one of my favorite games on the NES and an absolute unsung hero from Capcom is this one here, Gunsmoke. Now, this is a Western, a very basic Western. You are, and it's a vertical shooter. Here's another one on this list, but you are playing as a cowboy and you have to go through the levels to collect the bounties and find the gear and get your way to the end to fight the gang leader that's there. And this is such a classic, fun game. Now, I do think the arcade version is a little bit more user-friendly than the NES version, just because there were more buttons, so you didn't have to press buttons together to shoot straight. So I think that's pretty cool. Like, I think that's a really nice feature, but the NES game is not bad by any stretch of the imagination. Like, once you figure out, and once you understand the kind of button press rhythm and cadence that you need to get yourself into, this game is solid, and it's one of my favorite shooters on the NES. And the soundtrack in this game is killer. Absolutely fantastic. One of Capcom's stronger games and a legitimate unsung hero on the NES. I remember the first time I saw Joe and Mac was actually on the Super Nintendo and not this NES version here. And I had no idea that it was an arcade game until, honestly, decades later. Like, this never was something I saw. It was not a game that was ever in any of the arcades I went to growing up. So playing the SNES version originally was amazing. It looked incredible. It looked like something that had just come to life. It was like a living cartoon. And playing the Joe and Mac release on the NES decades later, I was kind of taken aback by the visuals. Like, it was decidedly a scaled down appearance, but when you get in game with Joe and Mac on the NES and you put it up against its arcade counterpart, it's a solid game. First off, the levels on the NES version are longer than the arcade version. The gameplay is equally challenging. It's not any easier or any more difficult, either one you go with. They're both fairly challenging titles. They're both really fun, though, and it's just really cool to see something taken from this beautiful 16-bit presentation that we got on both the SNES and in arcades, and kind of have it dumbed down to the NES release, but not in a negative way. It was just a solid classic port for a great arcade game that just worked on the NES. This is my favorite Pac-Man game. I love Pac-Mania. Now, I am a huge fan of the original Pac-Man. I love Ms. Pac-Man. I like the 3D Pac-Man games like Pac-Man World and Pac-Man and the Ghostly Adventures, but my favorite is Pac-Mania, and I adore the arcade release. The arcade version of Pac-Mania might be top 5 arcade games all time for me, just because it's so much fun. I love the idea of an isometric, basically 3D Pac-Man game where you can jump over the ghosts. I think that's super cool. And the NES release is fantastic. Now, it does not look as good. It does not play as good as the original arcade release, but the game itself is solid, and it is a lot of fun. I seriously just cannot say enough good things about Pac-Mania, both on the NES and in arcades. Like, the original is a classic. It's one of the best for a reason, and Ms. Pac-Man improves on it in every single way, but for me, Pac-Mania is the game that's getting my quarters if I see it at an arcade. Now, this is the one that loses the most in translation from its arcade original to its home console port, specifically the NES version, but I can't help but love Super Off-Road. Now, I've told the story many times on the channel, but as I do love to hear myself talk and pontificate, I will do so again. Super Off-Road was the arcade game that was in the lobby of the Super Walmart in Cape Coral, Florida, where I grew up with my grandparents. And every day, after school, I would go home, I would snag some quarters from my grandpa's stash, and I would head up to Walmart to play Super Off-Road. Now, there's nothing that compares to that free-spinning steering wheel, but the home console port on the NES is surprisingly good. Like, this game is really solid. It captures the experience of playing the game in the arcades just on an 8-bit console. Doesn't look as good, doesn't sound as good, doesn't perform as well, but as far as taking something that was spectacular like the arcade version of Super Off-Road and turning it into something really fun on the NES, they crushed it. This game's a blast. Showed this game during the introduction, so it absolutely has to be on this list. This is Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, both to the arcade game and just the classic arcade original of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. I remember the first time I saw this game. I think it was at a skating rink in Massachusetts where I first saw this. It was either there or at Mike Greenwell's Bat-a-Ball Family Fun Park in Cape Coral, Florida. But this game just captured my imagination instantly the second I saw it. I was a huge Ninja Turtles fan, and the ability to play as one of my favorite characters that looked like the cartoon I loved and not the original NES game that didn't really look like the Ninja Turtles that I had in my head from the cartoon. This was the cartoon come to life. The arcade was stunning. And to see it come to life on the NES, which did not look as good, did not sound as good, and was missing all of the digital voices, was still pretty remarkable because the levels were longer on the NES release as compared to the arcade version. And it was a truly fun game. It wasn't something that was half-assed in any way. It was a full-featured, fully fun game, and I love it to this day. One of my absolute favorites. Now, I'm going to pick the arcade version every single time if I get the opportunity to play it, if I have to choose between the two of them, but the NES version of Ninja Turtles, the arcade game, is solid. It's a really fun title. Oh, Toki, you're such a weird-ass game, but man, what? There's nothing that screams 1980s more than a buff caveman that turns into a spitting chimpanzee that wears a football helmet to protect himself. It's such a weird idea for a game, but it works really well. The arcade game original is really fun, and it's got a really unique look. It's decidedly its own thing. Like, there was nothing like Toki out there. And the NES version is surprisingly solid. Now, like every other game on this list, it doesn't look as good. Well, every other game except Contra. It doesn't look as good as its arcade counterpart, and from an audio perspective, it doesn't sound as good as its arcade counterpart, but the gameplay is nearly identical. It's a solidly challenging game that captures the entire spirit of the original arcade release just on a home console cartridge, and that's pretty remarkable in the grand scheme of things. If you've never played this one, it's definitely worth checking out, because it's, like I said, it's a really weird concept for a game, and somehow it works, and somehow it works really well. Like, it's not just like, oh yeah, no, I can see what they were going for there. Like, this is just a fun title, and it's ridiculous, but it's awesome. And there's actually a Switch version as well of Toki that's really, really cool. It's got a balsa wood arcade cabinet you can build to slide your Switch into to play the game on an arcade. It's great. So yeah, conspicuous by its absence on this list, despite the fact that it is one of my favorite games, is Popeye. I didn't feature it just because it basically does look the same. I just wanted to show off some differences here. Those are just some of my favorite arcade ports on the NES. Let me know in the comments down below your favorite arcade ports on the NES. If this is your first time on the channel, why don't you click that like button? The engagement helps the channel out. And if you dig the work, why don't you subscribe? I'd love to have you stick around. We're going for 15K by the end of the year. Until next time, folks, I've been Jay. Appreciate you spending a little bit of time with me. Remember to play more games, stay square, and take care. I'll talk to you soon.